My name is Robert Scafe, and I'm a lecturer here in the expository writing program at OU. In this tutorial, I want to introduce you to the skills that you need to integrate quotations smoothly into your writing. Now, if you've started working with quotes from your primary sources already, you've probably discovered that using them can be trickier than it seems at first. It can be a challenge to separate the important parts from the words you don't need, for example, or to figure out how to blend another author's wording with your own. Now, these problems have solutions, and if you watch this video to the end, you'll be equipped with a set of tools that will give you the confidence to start blending quotations into your own writing. In particular, I'm going to touch on 1, introducing quotes. That is, what you should say to set up the quotation and how to smoothly connect your own words with the beginning of the quote. And 2, cutting and blending. How you can chop up quotations and weave them together with your own language. Let's begin by comparing a raw, undigested quotation with a well-integrated one, and then we'll discuss how you get from point A to point B. Now, this passage comes from an essay about American environmentalism and the national parks in the early 20th century. Take a second to read it, imagining what it would be like to encounter such a citation in a history essay. This is a classic example of a dangling quotation, or a quote that's simply been dropped into the middle of a text without any editing or blending. I think you can see how bringing a long quotation like this in from a completely different context creates confusion for the reader. Just to cite a few examples, the first word, nevertheless, signaled in Muir's original that he was complicating something that he just said. But in this new context, it creates confusion because the quote isn't intended to refute the sentence that preceded it, but to prove it. Similarly, the pronoun they in the quotation refers to something in the previous sentence. But since that's not included, we're left to guess. Is the phrase they have always been subject to attack, is it talking about the environmentalists mentioned earlier, or is it talking about the national parks? Let's see how the author solved these problems, and some other ones, by chopping out the confusing bits and blending what remained with their own words. This revision does 3 things right to help the reader assimilate the quote and to see how it supports the writer's argument. First, it begins by clearly indicating who's speaking and in what context. Second, it selects the most important bits from the original text, leaving aside distracting words and focusing the reader's attention on what matters most. And third, instead of simply moving on after the quote is finished, the revision helpfully explains to the reader what they're supposed to be getting out of Muir's words. In short, where the raw quotation may have left the reader disoriented, the blended quotation focuses their attention on how Muir's words prove the writer's point. Now let's look at each of these skills in more detail, starting with introducing. When you quote, you want to prepare your reader to grasp its significance by explaining who is speaking and in what context. In its most basic form, introducing starts with clearly attributing authorship. For example, by writing John Muir states, or Muir explains that, as a kind of lead-in to the quotation. Now that last part, as a lead-in to the quotation, is really important, because if you don't actually name your author in the same sentence where you begin to quote, it's really easy to confuse your reader. For example, while the first version did mention John Muir in the sentence prior to the quotation, It also cited environmentalists in general. Thus, when you start reading the quote, you might think this is Muir speaking, but you might think it's some other environmentalist, or you might even think it's a modern historian who's talking about Muir and the environmentalists. Now, to be sure, the reader in this case will probably figure it out eventually, but you really want to avoid disorienting your reader like this by blending your introductory comments with the quotation. Now, sometimes students hesitate to blend their introductory remarks this way because they're confused about how to connect them. So let me give you a few basic rules on how to use punctuation when you fuse your own words with theirs. If you're introducing with some version of he or she says, use a comma to connect your introduction with the quotation, like this. If the quoted material is already meshed with your own words, then you don't need to use a comma. Here's an example. Now, you would not put a comma here between as and a worthy object if you weren't quoting, so you don't need to just because there's a quotation mark there. Note that this same rule applies even when you introduce a quotation with says that, as we did here. So even though we wrote John Muir explains, the addition of that means you no longer need a comma. In short, only use a comma to introduce a quote when the syntax would normally require it, or when you use some version of says right before the quoted material. Finally, you use a colon instead of a comma when you're announcing quotations that are more than one sentence, or for quotes longer than 4 lines. For example, if you were to write, Stanton declared, the right is ours, have it we must, use it we will, you would use the colon, even though this is a short quotation, because this quotation is more than 1 sentence long. If your quotation is longer than 4 lines, you should also introduce it with a colon. And in this case, you want to take the additional step of transforming it into a block quotation. Now, you make block quotations by indenting the entire quotation, single spacing, and by omitting the quotation marks. This might be surprising, but you don't need those quotation marks anymore because the block tells you that it's a quote. Now, it's important to know how to form block quotations because there will be times when you can't avoid presenting a large chunk of text. You should be aware, however, that it's generally considered better to use short, edited quotations when you can, and particularly in a short history essay. So it's important to clearly connect your authors with their words. But in history writing, the author's not just a name. An author is a person acting in a particular place and in a particular time. So in addition to naming authors, historians often introduce their quotations with context about the writer and their circumstances. In our case, for example, the writer noted that John Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club, that this article was written in 1908, and that the motivation for writing the article was the damming of the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. And there's no hard and fast rule about how much context you should add, but just bear in mind these principles. 1. Include contextual information that the reader needs to understand the significance of the quote that follows. In this case, for example, the fact that John Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club is vital for understanding his importance as a representative of the environmentalist movement at this time. 2. Include details about the author the first time you introduce them, but don't keep repeating them when you quote them again. For example, you want to use the author's whole name, John Muir, the first time that you introduce them, but after that you can just switch to Muir goes on to say. You might cite the date and title of his article the first time you use it, but there's no need to keep doing that when you quote from it later in the essay. So let's look at our quotation now that the author has been properly introduced to see what else we could do to sharpen its focus. So we've added some contextual details about the author to orient the reader, and we've blended these with the beginning of the quotation by cutting the confusing word nevertheless. But there's still some problems here. First, The quote is still too long. It contains so much information that the reader isn't really sure what they're supposed to be focusing on. And two, even though we've gotten rid of the confusing word nevertheless, there are still parts of this quotation that are out of context and that make it hard to follow. Now, in order to prevent these problems, experienced quoters often chop up longer quotations and blend the smaller bits with their own words. The guidelines for doing this kind of editing are very simple. 1. Keep the words that are important to proving your assertion and cut those that would distract you from your main point. 2. Don't change the meaning of the original quotation in the process of doing this. So you always want to start when you're cutting by asking, what's my purpose here? What am I using this quotation to show? In this case, the writer wants to suggest that John Muir portrayed the profit motive as an evil, insipid force that would inevitably exploit the natural parks if it isn't stopped. Which words do we need to keep to illustrate that argument? Well, we're interested in Muir's demonization of the lumbermen and the ranchers, so let's keep these words that connect them to Satan and that designate the parks as a sacred temptation for evil. But we can eliminate the parenthetical like everything else worthwhile. It's really just a distracting aside. Certainly, we want to keep despoiling gain seekers, since that designates the profit motive. But then we could probably omit what follows, mischief makers of every degree, because it clutters up the sentence without adding anything that we need. And finally, let's keep the memorable expression smiling philanthropy, which underscores the deviousness of the profiteer's encroachments on nature. However, we'll cut the rest so we can introduce smiling philanthropy more flexibly using our own words. The result, once you've supplied the connective tissue by summarizing or paraphrasing what Muir said in your own words, is something like this. Notice how taking control over the connective language between the quoted bits helps the writer solve some of the problems of contextualizing the quote. For example, in the original, the pronoun they in "they have always been subject to attack" is really ambiguous because we don't know who they is referring to. Is it referring to environmentalists? Is it referring to the national parks? Who's being attacked here? In fact, earlier in the original text, Muir was talking about national parks, so the writer clarifies the meaning by substituting his own wording, national parks, for the quotation. Get in the habit of weaving your own wording into your quotations, and you'll have the flexibility to overcome these sticky problems, like pronouns without antecedents, or conflicts in verb tenses, and so on. Weaving short quotations into your own wording solves many of the problems you face when quoting. Sometimes, however, you still need to alter the author's original wording to make it mesh with your own, or to clarify something in its meaning. In these situations, you can use ellipses or brackets to show where you've changed the original text. You can use ellipses, or those 3 dots, to edit out unnecessary or inconvenient language. In our citation, for example, the writer has edited out mischief makers of every degree, along with the dash, because they make an already long sentence just a bit too choppy. When you edit quotes like this, just be sure not to change their original meaning in the process. For example, if the writer had quoted despoiling gain seekers of every degree from Satan to supervisors, but if they had omitted lumbermen, cattlemen, and farmers, this would really change Muir's meaning. Muir was not just creating a scale of nature despoilers from the devil to bosses. He was also including more down-to-earth types, like ranchers and farmers. So to omit this might suggest that he's only criticizing the rich, not more sympathetic characters like farmers and ranchers. To avoid changing Muir's intent, In this case, don't use the ellipses, but keep the original phrasing. You can also use square brackets to make minor changes to help the quotations better fit your own wording. Here's an example. In the original quotation, despoiling isn't capitalized, but it has to be to start this sentence. So the writer has indicated the change by putting the capital D in brackets. Similarly, she chose to add an and in brackets before farmers and delete the etc. that Muir ended with. Let me conclude by emphasizing that introducing and blending quotations are skills that take practice. It might seem presumptuous or difficult at first to make these changes to an author's original words, but you'll get the hang of it as long as you remember these few basic principles. 1. Introduce your authors. As simple as it sounds, we really need to know who is speaking, and the first time you introduce them, we need to know a bit about who they were and why they were writing. 2nd, chop your quotations. Edit long quotations down to the smaller bits that you really need to prove your case. This not only focuses your reader's attention on your argument, it also makes it easier for you to solve some of the problems that raw quotations pose when you insert them into your own prose. 3. Blend quotes grammatically. Don't hesitate to use paraphrasing, ellipses, or brackets to help you smooth the connection between the original text and your own writing. And finally, number 4, respect the evidence. Don't significantly alter the original meaning. You can cut repetitive or parenthetical words, but be sure you're not changing the gist of what the author intended to argue.